The Situation Room continues into the third hour on this Monday, the 28th of... Did I go ahead? I'm just wanting to finish the month. 27th? I was right
you're
the
24
first time.
hours, but it's okay.
Oh,
Okay. You're ahead of your time.
It's better to be ahead than to be behind.
Oh, but I'm ahead of my time. Guys,
Progressives.
okay. It's the 20-somethings of April. That should do. So long as we're awake.
Either that or your bank account is whispering.
My dear, it's shouting. Right. So, of course, you're hearing the voices, and we're getting into a conversation around the PBO deadline. And if you're going to ask yourself, what is the PBO? It's the Public Benefit Organization Bill Act, essentially what we're looking at. We're going to go into the details and why that's important this morning. But for us to be able to have that conversation, two folks join us today. Faith Kisinga-Gitonga is an advisor enabling environment for non-profit organizations in the hot seat this morning. Good morning.
Good morning.
Welcome to the Situation Room.
Thank you.
It's going to be an interesting conversation for people who didn't even know what this was in the first place and how it affects you. We probably have the best minds to talk about that conversation. You've heard him as well. The second Irungu for the day.
Yes, this one from Dagoretti North. That one is from Muranga. But there are many of us. You know, there's 65,000 Irungus in this country.
There are not.
I counted them.
Should I be a bit worried that you counted them?
No, this is from the census or whatever it is, the registration of births.
So one of the 65,000 Irungus is here this morning.
Thank you.
Irungu Houghton is the Executive Director of Amnesty International Kenya, and is here with us this morning as well. Karibuni sana both. As we get into this. Dennis has gone to Equatorial Guinea this morning. He has some fun facts about that country.
So the president has been in office for 47 years. I wasn't a plan. Yes,
It wasn't even a plan.
It wasn't even a plan.
It wasn't even a date.
You know, but as we talk about that, there's a country that is rich in resources, oil deposits, right? But it's another African story. You know, we have all this, but it goes outside, then we buy finished product. But it's looked at, see if they have a strong economic potential if they work on it and they invest back to the people. But let's go to the proverb. When the roots are deep, there is no reason to fear wind. When the roots are deep, there is no reason to fear wind. Ladies, go first. How would you interpret it?
When the roots are deep, there is no reason
to fear wind.
To fear wind. A very important an analogy. If you're well grounded, whether in values or in terms of identity, then whatever kind of crisis comes your way in terms of, the environment or in terms of occurrences, events, then you really can stand strong and you will remain resilient. There are those events where, there's somebody who did an experiment some years back, and they tried to grow things in space. And one of the things that they found out is that the lack of wind led to the trees not faring, the plants not faring very well, especially the trees, only to discover that it was the lack of wind was what led to that very poor growth. And yet we usually fear wind and crises, and yet they are necessary for us to really strengthen and to be able to then face other crises in an even better way.
Do is shaking her head like, profound. It has exceeded the proverb.
Irungu, how would you interpret it?
So I can only build on what Faith said. So I think it's 3-4 weeks ago, Too Early for the Birds took place. 4,000 Kenyans watched the tribute to Wangari Maathai. And I was present then to the power of Wangare's, I guess, both courage, but also her foresight. And she would say that, when you plant a tree, you start by preparing the ground. And I think the same point, which is if the ground is prepared well, the tree will flourish and the wind will not cause a problem. I think the same thing with this law that we're about to talk about, the PBO Act. Act essentially is a legal framework that if it is nurtured, if it is supported, it will withstand the winds, not just of the 2027 elections, but I think as we go through for the next decade or couple of decades, because there are some very strong winds affecting the non-governmental organizations community, or as we say, the civil society, or as we now say, the public benefits organizations.
Right. Public benefit organizations, of course, we're asking questions this morning in terms of, what next for national civil society? Where is that space? Is it a space that's reducing, or is it a space that has the potential to increase? Both of you have done some significant work in terms of protecting that space over time. I mean, it's been a long journey in just trying to ensure that you have someone aside government who is going to work on a particular area to ensure that the things of constitutionalism are protected. So let's start off with that, really. I guess from a space where we're asking the question, has the space shrunk beyond salvation? Or are we saying that there's still something that can be done through this PBO Act today? Where are we seeing that space now is storing? We'll start off with you.
Can I, with all due respect, allow me to send some flowers?
Okay, send them quickly so that we can hear.
Yes, Irungu has been in this struggle. Indeed, it has been a long journey. As far back as the 1990s, he engaged with others, engaged the Moi Kanu State on the National Coordination Act of the 1990s. With others, he stopped 5 sets of draconian amendments to the same act in the 2014 to 2017 period, and with others lobbied for this particular act. Faith, for her part, is a seasoned legal policy expert who, from the inception of the bill, engaged and advised civil society regulatory agencies on the legislation affecting CSOs. She's a published author who works on civil society law and has a handbook on the PBO Act, Know Your Rights as a CSO. And she continues to support civil society organizations for compliance around the PBO. So the people we have in the room really have walked this journey. They've supported this journey. They have a lot to give us. I just wanted to put those flowers out there. Yes, so that we know why the discussion has been already elevated at the proverb level, even before we started. Begin. And no bias on my part. Sorry, Ndu, back to you.
So I guess you can go ahead with that. So we'll start with you, Faith.
Okay. So has the space shrunk? The whole term of shrinking space has been with us now for so many years.
Yeah.
So you wonder, has it been shrinking all the while, or has it always been shrinking? Is it closed now completely? We have a constitution that was meant to open the space. We have this PBO Act that was even meant to open it even much further, and yet was not commenced, at least for 12 years. So now, with the announcement of the commencement, and even as we have regulations that have even been passed to ensure now its implementation, the whole hope that the space now will begin to open further is definitely there within the sector. I can say that at least since 2013, the space has been considerably shrinking. We've seen a lot of activities towards at least bringing about amendments to what was touted all over the world as a very progressive law for civil society, and with not a year had even passed after the PBO Act had been signed into law, that we actually saw an amendment bill that was proposing amendments to this act. So by October, when the law was signed in January, we were beginning to see a raft of amendments, most of them targeting funding to the sector, and even expanding the space for the executive on the regulatory body of the PBO regulator. And so this definitely began to send signals that civil society needs to tone down, that they're taking up too much space and they're being viewed as a threat. And so suddenly, from that time onwards, it was very clear to civil society that the mistrust that had existed before between them and the state had now again erupted, and that they were not going to be comfortable coexisting anymore. And so from that time, there has been a lot of talk about the shrinking space, and it has been evident even through the engagement between the two sectors that what they had dreamt about and put into the PBO Act was not going to be realized that easily. And so now, as we even head into implementation of the Act, we're just hoping that now we're going to begin to see signs of that space beginning to open up. Yeah.
Irungu, what are some of the drivers of this Act that essentially would change some of these factors that Faith brings up? What is in the Act, essentially?
Yeah. So the Act, which I have to say is quite it's quite a unique Act in the sense that it was passed, it was assented. I think, as Faith has said, immediately there was resistance to it. Right. So over the 2010s, there was a period between 2000 and I think 2014, particularly to 2017, where the state tried to amend the NGO Coordination Act and refused to bring in the PBO Act for like 4 to 5 years. 900 non-governmental organizations were arbitrarily deregistered, including some of the most well-known human rights organizations like the Kenya Human Rights Commission. You saw attempts to try and shift funding from the sector. Like 85% of the funding that would come into the sector by law through this amendment was destined to head back to the state. And it's only because because governance and human rights organizations and health organizations, if I remember, particularly fought back against this act. So it's within that context that I think the PBO Act needs to be looked at. There are a number of important developments. One is, for example, around the idea that public benefits organizations, and the term is quite a simple one, is that any institution that produces public benefits or benefits for the public is a public benefits organization. So if you think about the raft of organizations, you've got trusts and foundations, you've got community-based organizations, you've got a whole range of international and national non-governmental organizations. All of that now fall within the public benefits organizations framework. So the first thing is that it's created a singular framework for all these institutions. First of all, to provide services, and in this context, advocacy is a service, right? I mean, this is the other thing I think that's exciting about the Act. But the other point about it is that if you're receiving public funding, either from individuals or from governments, you have a higher level of integrity and a level of obligation to manage that money well. Right. I remember back in 1994 with the now she's on the Supreme Court, Joking Dungu. We arbitrated between an NGO of directors, and the executive director had decided that it was a good idea for the NGO to be paying rent to one of his properties. Of course, right? And the board was up in an uproar. There was a massive breakdown, and we actually had to mediate and explain that it is not acceptable for public money to go into private hands, even if you're the executive director, particularly because you're the executive director. So I think the conflict of interest principles within the PBO Act are really important. The second one is it's framed within the freedom of association. And this idea that Article 36 says that everybody has the right to associate, and that association is independent of political patronage. And maybe the last one that I would probably bring in is that the processes of registration, whether it be the name or the organization itself or the management of the organization or the dissolution of the organization, that cannot be subject to arbitrary decisions by state administrators. It has to be subject to the right to be heard, the right to reply, and even there is now within this act that wasn't there before a tribunal So you can actually, within 30 days, request for an independent assessment of whether, an action that's being taken against you should be taken against you. And I think that, these are the core functions of the Act. The other one I think that's important, particularly in this era now, and we've just, as Amnesty International, published our human rights report. One of the things we found there was that international funding for non-governmental organizations has begun to shrink dramatically. So you're talking about shrinking civil space. The more dangerous thing is shrinking funding. And there, what the PBO Act does is it creates at least two channels of funding for this sector. The first is an international solidarity. So it creates a framework for international donors, philanthropic organizations, individuals to contribute. But the other thing it does is it allows and begins to start a very important conversation that Kenyans need to have, which is that, much of the work that civil society organizations do must be funded by Kenyans first and foremost, because that builds the accountability, it builds the predictability of the funding. And that's why this act is so important, because there's a whole schedule that talks about, support for people who want to give to the sector as opposed to only giving in the form of taxes. Right. Now, the question is, the law is great. Implementation is the most important thing.
And I think as we talk about the law, right, we look at this act right now as not just being completely illegal. Politics as well plays into it, and with that then we have two factors that we have to consider. So there is the opportunities that come with that and the risks that are involved. So as we look at this bill and its implementation and the political class and how they would want to jump on this or to make it difficult in the implementation phase, what are we looking at, and what are some of the stopgap measures that we have to deal with that when they do come? Because remember, we are headed into 2027, and these definitely will come up. So some of the stopgap measures that perhaps the PBOs are preparing themselves to deal with.
Yeah, so stopgap measures, definitely there are some key risks. And one, we could actually look at the whole issue of self-regulation, which has been embedded in the Act, being one of those elements that can actually be used to safeguard the sector from external interference. If you look at the history of the NGO sector, in around from about 2003, 2004 onwards, about the time when we had a split of the NGO Council, up till today, the NGO Council has never really recovered. We've had claims and even evidence that there had been quite a bit of interference with the leadership of the council, and to a large extent, the trust that the sector had with the council was completely lost. Most of the time, there were claims that it was political interference. And so being able to come up with self-regulation body, or even a representative body that at least is guarded against that kind of interference was one of the reasons why the revision of the NGO Coordination Act actually settled for, at the very beginning, a kind of self-regulation framework that had quite diverse self-regulation bodies, so that we were not looking at just one body that could be infiltrated, but at least several that represented the interests of the sector and ensured that at least that was more effective at the grassroots level. But later on, with a lot of, I'd say, inclusion of different provisions, we ended up with now a national federation of PBOs, which now is also beginning to face quite a bit of, I'd say, challenges, because what has happened is that the NGO Council has actually insisted that they will now continue on as the new federation or the new self-regulation body. And this definitely is going to be a bone of contention to the sector, because they feel that they need to come up with a new body And the Act actually envisaged a new body that would protect the sector and ensure coordination, accountability, transparency through self-regulation. So if we do not carefully come up with this body or carefully ensure that it is established in a way that the whole sector will have trust in it, then we might be headed back the same way in terms of the problems we had with self-regulation. The other issue is independence of the regulator or the authority, which definitely was taken care of by ensuring that the way it is established in the Act will ensure that it is safeguarded from any political interference. So again, as we head into implementation, the questions that have been raised around the independence and the way this regulatory authority is run and established will need to be really taken care of. Throughout, we have definitely seen that politics plays a very important role in the civic space expansion or shrinking. From 1990 all the way up till today, it has been a key factor in ensuring that that space is either enjoyed or problematic. We cannot ignore it.
Right. So there are lots of advantages. I think this is a critical milestone. This is a process that civil society has really shepherded, contributed to, and negotiated around. Now that it's here, and we are in a contentious time with possibly quite a government. Let's talk about an increasingly surveillance state, a state that's very sensitive about the forthcoming elections and about its own legitimacy and ability to continue. What's the prognosis for the PBO Act in this context? Because if I was sitting in a certain seat, I'd be thinking, I don't really want a strong civil society. It needs to bend to my will, and we'd prefer to have civil society that does service delivery. So there's an act. We know implementation of law is a problem in this context. We know there's a problem with. So what is the reality, and how, you've talked about risks. I think I'm talking about how do we implement, because civil society are transiting. I think the deadline is this coming month. So we are now going to be under the PBO Act. What is the prognosis for the Act coming into force and these ambitions being realized?
I mean, I think it's useful, first of all, to just put in context what is the sector, right? So the NGO sector, at the moment we don't have reliable figures on public benefits organizations generally, because there are too many regimes and too many organizations that are not being documented well. And this is part of the power of the PBO Act, and it's also the danger when it comes to the mass surveillance and abusive executive office. But what we know from the NGO sector is that something like 9,000 out of 14,000 NGOs are still very active. And they produce something like about 246 billion shillings in revenue every year. That's an employment, bracket of about 70,000 Kenyans. Much of the funding goes into health and into, responding to displacement, forced migration, and conflict-related issues. And of course, much of it is anti-poverty. The governance sector and the human rights sector is actually very small, right, financially. And also in terms of numerically the number of organizations, at least according to last year's 2025 bill. So I think this is the context that we are kind of always thinking about. The dangers of political capture are real. Right, they are somewhat. The PBO Act is a better act to fight against political capture than the NGO Coordination Act, the act that we are migrating from, because that was a one-party state act. It did not essentially put in any safeguards. And I've mentioned the tribunal. I've mentioned the independent. Faith has mentioned the independent PBO authority. So there are a number of levers within the act that actually prohibit political capture. And it's really important that the political elites and the authoritarians that seem to traverse our state offices, that they must step back and allow this sector to be able to breathe and to do what it does best, which is to hold the state accountable and to also create civic education. I remember, over the last two elections, 2017 and 2022, having very intense conversations with senior officers from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs when they had essentially issued note verbals to the donor community just before the elections, that the donor community must not fund civic education, and they must not fund civic education by NGOs or by the IABC. And the dangers were clear to me back then, which is essentially if you have a populace that is not educated on its rights or its ability to vote and has no inspiration from the political class, they will exit the exercise we call elections.
Right.
And what you will have is a disenfranchisement of large numbers of young people who are extremely powerful potentially. Now, what we saw break out in the streets in 2024 and 2025 was a young population whose patience had just snapped. Now, the same thing could happen as we go into these elections. If the state tries to control our right to funding and our right to seek funding from wherever it is, we have an obligation to report. That is acceptable. But the state does not have the right to block us from accessing either international finance or local finance.
Can I ask that, just on that point, that before an in this case a PBO comes into operation in country, that there are already there are prerequisites towards establishment. Is there an understanding between host nation in this case and these PBOs about what you can and or cannot do?
Yeah, it's very clear.
It's clear.
In a code of conduct.
All right.
It's all very clear.
So on what premise then would a state, from MOFA in this case, be able to tell PBO
or a donor
or a donor that you cannot engage in civic education, for example?
Yeah.
And is it outside of the confines of the agreement?
It is. I mean, it's unlawful. It's not just unconstitutional, but it is also against international human rights practice.
Okay.
So it is only authoritarian states that go in that direction. I think we have, unfortunately, a couple on our borders. Let me just speak about the sovereignty bill in Uganda. One of the most idiotic legal frameworks that's come out of Uganda in the last 40 years. I mean, the anti-homosexuality bill was pretty bad. This one turns a number of Ugandans into foreigners. I mean, literally, if you are a family member who receives money from your diasporan nephew or niece, you could be classified as a foreigner because you're receiving foreign funding. And the danger that we're seeing now with Uganda, and I think, if the parliament continues to debate it and actually pass the bill, what you might have is something like $9 billion be removed from inflows to Uganda, either in terms of remittances or in terms of international finance or in terms of development financing. And I think that's the thing that the Kenyan administrators need to be very clear about, is that when you start to put difficulties in a sector that is worth 246 billion shillings, what you're doing is essentially denying the country revenue. What you're doing is reducing the capacity for this sector to employ Kenyans. 70,000 Kenyans are recruited and employed by this sector. And I think that's sometimes forgotten. As the politicos, if I can call it this, as the politicos think about their survival and their inability to inspire Kenyans to come out and vote for them, they tend to go in the authoritarian direction.
Right.
And I think it is a self-defeating measure, as we will see in Uganda.
As you say that, Irungu, it takes me back to, was it 2014?
Yeah.
When I think you made the same appeal.
Yeah.
The sector may have been a bit larger in terms of numbers. Maybe the GDP contribution was a bit smaller. But at that point, it was the now governor,
Anwaiguru.
Minister of Devolution, and the freeze, and I think you alluded to that in your opening statement, there was a freeze on funding to civil society. Is there an attempt to drive civil society into more development approaches and away from holding power to account? And maybe the way I can ask that question is, what kind of civil society does the bill envisage? Because there's also declining funding. There's also, this kind of rewriting the rules of multilaterally or of the international order. So what type of civil society should we then be looking towards? And what kind of state support or state conduct is expected around that? And I think even the private sector is now coming into this. So where are we going? We have an act. We have a government, we can see its intentions. The civil society sector, I believe, will continue to fight. But where are we going? Yeah.
That's such an easy question. Good. Ask Faith to go first.
Well done.
Irungu.
That's a big one.
Wow.
Almost in the realm of prophecies.
I was looking towards you, thinking, he's got it.
Faith, we call you prophetess Faith.
Oh my goodness. Because Shiro asked, I think I will try and attempt to answer it. This whole issue of whether NGOs or PBOs are now being pushed towards delivery, we have seen over the years that seems to be the area that the government seems to be more comfortable with them playing a role in. Even the amendments that were pushed in 2013, 2014, had a kind of sense that, we were trying to copy what we were seeing in the region, where there were laws that tried to decrease funding that was headed towards organizations doing advocacy and human rights work. So in Ethiopia, we had the Proclamation of Charities regulation that actually said that if you receive more than 10% of your funding from external donors, then you should not or should desist from doing human rights and democracy rights-related work. And so, very soon after that, and that was in 2009. So for us now coming in 2013, we were really just borrowing a leaf from what was happening in the neighborhood. And so when our amendments were actually saying that you cannot get more than 15% of your funding from external donors, and that you needed to get approval from the Minister of Finance if indeed you wanted to do work that indeed you needed funding that was coming from external donors, and that they would determine whether you could actually increase that threshold of external funding depending on what they viewed to be their own reasons, really. The term used, and I think which was very broad, was legitimate and compelling reasons, which could be anything according to them. But I remember the meeting we had, we actually had a meeting at the Ministry of Devolution. The sector was trying to push against these amendments. And one of the things I remember listening to the then Minister for Devolution at that time telling us was that you don't need to worry, the amendments actually will be looking to see how that threshold, especially for organizations doing work around health, education, and other organizations, can actually be improved. So basically saying that the discretion will be there for the administration to decide or determine who will be eligible to external funding. And but as far as we are concerned, where we feel you're not eligible, then we might even shrink it further. So that push definitely came at that point. But if you look back historically, even to the 1990s, when we had the NGO coordination bill passed, part of the proposals then were that funding would come through the government from external donors before it's then extended to NGOs or PBOs. So that idea of how do we then control this funding so that these actors who are now increasingly becoming engaged in calls for reform or expansion of democracy are not as powerful as they are beginning to look, has always been there. And it's not changed. It just keeps morphing in terms of from more, overt actions to more subtle ways, so that now we are using the law, or we're using now self-regulation where you infiltrate the body, So different ways, but in which we are looking at how can we then control this sector.
And that right there, then, when you talk about funding Irungu, there is also the role that Kenyans then have to play with the new act, where Kenyans then can be part and parcel of funding these PBOs in the country, so that at the end of the day, there is no government that would say someone from the United States is funding you to fight my government or for you to make it difficult for me. That Kenyans as well need to look at this act as something that will give them power in funding these organizations that speak for them, that want change to be pushed, because then again, that is what the PBOs have done for a very long time. But how do we then bring Kenyans to partake or to consume this information? Because it could be there in the act, but if Kenyans don't know about it, it does not help the case. So how do we rope in Kenyans to understand their role in this new act?
Yeah. I think the scenario I think that's emerging for me is an interesting one. So if you take a long perspective, right? If you go back to the 1990s, this was the period of structural adjustment programs. The state was beginning to withdraw. Donor pressure was extremely high. Donor conditionality was very high, and services were essentially being depleted. And that's how NGOs became so powerful in the service delivery period. We then moved into a period where African governments declared that they were development states. So that's when the universal primary education was introduced, primary healthcare was attempted. There was vast investments in water and agriculture and things like that. So you had a decade of delivery, or I guess state development services. With the rising, debt challenges that states are having, and tremendous corruption and mismanagement, and the reluctance of states to provide enough civic space for people to be able to check corruption, either at the county levels or at the national levels, what you're seeing now essentially is we're going back to the 1990s in a broad sense. But of course, the difference is this is a digital nation, right? So you've got social media, you've got the use of different technologies that you can use now in different ways, including crowdfunding. So I think that's one scenario. The second scenario is that the state inevitably is going to shrink in terms of its ability to provide services. When you see the tendency towards privatization, selling the family jewels in order that the administration can survive another 5 to 10 years. That's essentially going back to the 1990s. These were the recommendations of the World Bank and IMF back in the 1990s. But I think the other thing you're going to start seeing is that civil society organizations or public benefits organizations are now going to become increasingly interested in developing relationships with citizens. Right, and I think that's where it gets more interesting. I do have it in some ways that the NGO, and this is different from the PBO, the NGO, this idea that you get funding from overseas, you spend it well, you report back, you ask for more funding, a bit like an ATM machine. That model has actually died, and that a new model has to be born, or if I can use a word that my English teacher would hate, the late Dr. Pamela Kola, has to be birthed. I think the challenge now is really thinking about, people's associations, mass associations, professional associations, neighborhood associations of people that come together and learn internal democracy by focusing on a particular issue and learning how to be responsible around that issue and around the resources that they have in common. And of course, the funding flows can be crowdfunding. Amnesty has increasingly now begun to see the power of membership, right? So our 1,600 members who give every year are now becoming a revenue stream that allows me to stop thinking about what are the donor fads.
Yeah.
Right. We're now looking at merchandise. We're now looking at other ways in which you can cleverly work with money markets, so that the little money that you've got you can leverage domestically. But the one thing that I think the PBO authority and Dr. Laxmana, I'm sure, is watching us right now with his team. The one thing that I think we need to introduce is specific steps towards how do we get tax incentives built into the sector so that actually people can give. There's a short-sightedness, I think, with KRA, which is to tighten all the avenues for taxation, and you actually squeeze out the potential and the courage of people to want to give more. In fact, if anything, we're all looking for as many mattresses as possible. Not me personally. Just in case,
we trust you. We believe you.
And amnesty for that matter. Everybody's looking for mattresses to hide money.
Money,
right?
yes.
And, this is just like a complete sabotage of this idea of a nation that actually, gives in order that the most marginalized get services. Right? So it's almost a counter, it's a defeating expert. So I think we're going to start seeing some interesting new models around crowdfunding. I'm still blown away by Hanifa Adan's raising of 34 million shillings in 1 month to pay hospital bills for Gen Z protesters who were hurt during that year. I think that's the beginning. TikTok fundraisers are now just massive. And just a word for the KRA people who are watching us. Please,
leave them alone.
Just leave them alone. It's
Yeah.
not
Let
broken.
them be.
Let them be. Let them create this culture. And 4 or 5 years from now, you will see the revenue from taxation begin to pick up. But if you crush it at this point, you're going to have to recruit staff in KRA whose job it is called mattress searching.
Just in case.
Yeah, like that could even be a job
Door to
description.
door.
Yeah, door-to-door mattress searcher.
Let me just tell KRA, in case I buy a new mattress, it's because I moved houses.
So
Right.
interestingly enough,
Looking for the depth,
there's this gentleman, President Donald Trump,
Yep.
when he came into office the second time round, he had a thing to say about what we are calling PBOs.
Yep.
And we saw a massive withdrawal of funding under his, from his word, essentially. And that some of the things that he said over and over and over again is that the hard-earned taxes of the American people that go towards, still NGOs, aid development organizations, then could not be accounted for, right? And he said this. It was very clear that it came from many quarters, and as a result of that, they were going to pull back on that. That what you saw was that folks who were giving their money then could not see where it went. That people would come here and they would drive the high-end vehicles and they would live in the mansions, but in terms of the effect on what it was supposed to then attain, that was not visible. And this is what he said. As a result of that, they were going to pull back on that. What kind of blight, if any, does it then have on what we are discussing today and, the crowdfunding that Irungu talks about? Is it because of the dry taps on one side, or are we saying that there have to be more innovative ways to then be able to do this? And what did it actually do to the sector with that announcement and that effective withdrawal?
Yeah.
Irungu, why are you looking around? Another easy question for you, Faith.
all the easy ones goes to you.
Yes. Yeah, I want to pick on Du's question about all of a sudden and say that this is something that the sector had been discussing for many years. The
Long before
whole
donation.
discussion of sustainability had always, they knew somewhere down the line something like this is going to happen, and so it's just like eventually it's coming, and then it happened. So it's not something that was very sudden in terms of them having had discussed it so often, but I guess the reality was that they needed something to happen for them
something
to
was
be
Trump.
forced into it.
So something was Trump.
Yes.
Okay. All right.
And that something was Trump. So the other thing that they also had been discussing at the same time was the how do they get the public to really understand what it is that they do and their role in society, so that they can then get the kind of support that you find NGOs and charitable organizations in the West getting. In fact, more than 50%. Sometimes you get even nearly 60 to 70, 80% of funding or support to these non-profit organizations coming from individuals. And that's because they believe in what these organizations are doing.
Yeah.
They are formed by citizens to actually push the things that are of importance to the citizens and to be a voice for these citizens. So how have we taken steps? How has the sector taken steps to ensure that the public resonates with the kind of work that they're doing, that they understand that it is actually, and that they understand that it is what they would like them to be doing. And it is not just coming from some donors' prerequisites, which has been the disconnection all along.
Yeah.
That a lot of the public feels that what is being done by quite a number of NGOs is really tied to some conditions or some, I'd say, instructions coming from organizations that are based out there. Once we are able to see that very clear understanding and even connection between the public and NGOs or PBOs, then we can begin to see the kind of support we saw just last year, going into into all types of things that the public resonates very strongly with.
And there had been a collection. I remember. I think it was for Turkana. There was a food drive.
Kenyans for Kenyans.
Kenyans for Kenyans. Again, I think it was quite a huge amount in a very short time. So it is possible. And thank you for the very candid conversations, because really what you're saying is that the donor dependency and kind of this civil society have had too much of a donor gaze in their work that has weakened their legitimacy, representation to the community. We then have now the PBO Act, and from what you're saying is that this is a good opportunity for civil society, but by the same token, there are new civil societies who will not fall under this act, because I believe associations are registered separately, differently. Maybe as societies or other, and they are very important. You then have this Gen Z movement and TikTokers and all who are content creators in the private sector, and they are doing governance and they are advancing human rights discussions. So it really sounds like there is change happening, even beyond what the state imagines in their is it small mind or big mind to muzzle the sector? There is change happening. And the question still then comes, the point you're raising, Faith, is how do you build this culture among Kenyans to support these vital spaces of accountability, whether it's through association, whether it's through NGO funding or PBO funding? And are PBOs now becoming gatekeepers of a space? And might they be squeezing out the new civil societies? Is there going to be a competition? Or what does that look like? I'm playing a little bit of devil's advocate. Yeah. And I'm throwing that to Irungu, who likes easy questions.
No, I think we need a steady vision, I think, at all levels. I think at the level of the state, I was comforted by the analysis by C.S. Murkomen, for example, when they, during the PBO week, when he said, let us not see a knee-jerk deregistration of hundreds of organizations, right? And I think he is learning the lesson that from the Anwaiguru period, right? That you actually just cause shocks to the system, and then the trust levels drop, and then people basically do not comply with the new laws. So I think that was kind of smart. Dr. Laxmana, who's in the PBO authority at the moment, I think one of the things that he needs to do is he needs to start the process of appointing these 15-member committee to oversee the transition, because I think that will introduce a bit of trust and faith in the process. trust is hard in this environment, right? So even if you have good wish, you have the good intentions, the fact of the matter is we are primed for conspiracy, and essentially we're a country of broken hearts, right? So we don't trust anybody, and we don't trust state, we don't trust civil society. Increasingly now, we don't trust the judiciary, and so on. So I think there is an obligation, I think, on a part of all of us to be able to create that. But I think coming back to the sector, I think for the NGOs, one of the things that they have to recognize is the energy that came out of the Gen Z movement over the last two years. For me, was a wake-up call. I mean, I met a 21-year-old content creator, and to be honest, the way she thinks about communications, narratives, and virility of messaging is light years ahead of many of the best NGOs doing this work. So I think we have to be humble, sit back, and look at what the energies are from the from the nation, and be able to catch up in some ways, not muzzle. Right? I think that's the danger, and
Right.
I think that's an important one. I think the other point there is really reminding ourselves that the best part of non-governmental organizations was this idea that we were essentially a group of citizens who were trying to either protect, well, first of all, to create a new constitutional framework, and then secondly, to protect that and to expand it. Right? So when it comes to things like civic freedoms, when it comes to socioeconomic rights, when it comes to identity rights, the idea that femicide is an abomination to our constitution and our moral conscience, and that we all need to be concerned about whether we are affected directly or not. I think that has to be the basis upon which we engage with the whole sector. 56 million citizens will always be more powerful than 9,000 non-governmental organizations.
Oh my
And
gosh.
that's the reality. And actually, I've done this with the Inspector General a couple of times. I've said to him, listen, you may have 100,000 police officers. You may even have... how many police stations? I keep forgetting the figure of police stations. However many police stations. But this all pales when you think about the individual unit of the citizen. So if you're not creating a culture in which citizens are empowered, they're engaged, and they're ethical, then actually you can't win, right? And that's our responsibility as an NGO sector as well.
Right.
Let me
Where
rest
we
it
are.
there.
And a great way to rest it, definitely. I mean, there's a lot to come in from these conversations. I want to thank both of you for being here with us this morning. Irungu Houghton is the Executive Director of Amnesty International Kenya, joined this morning by Faith Kisinga Kitonga, who's an advisor enabling environment for non-profit organizations. Asante for steering this conversation with us this morning. Thank you very much. Good morning.
This is the Situation Room, the only way to start your day.